In 1415, a man walked calmly toward his execution, singing hymns as his voice rose clearly above the crackling flames that were about to engulf him. Jan Hus, a priest from Bohemia who had dared confront the mightiest institution of his age, had been granted safe conduct by an emperor and the protection of the Holy Roman Empire itself. Yet when the fire consumed his body, those solemn promises turned to ashes alongside his flesh. Far from silencing him, his death would spark a revolution that shook medieval Europe to its core and whose echoes still reach us today. Europe in the early 15th century was reeling from crisis. The Catholic Church, long the unchallenged guardian of souls, was sinking in scandal and division. The Great Schism had split the papacy, with rival popes excommunicating one another while corruption rotted the hierarchy from parish priest to cardinal. Village clergy demanded money for sacraments, bishops hoarded wealthy benefices while ignoring their flocks, and the papal court lived in splendor as peasants starved. Above all, the Church grew rich selling indulgences, pieces of paper that promised salvation to whoever paid the most. Faithful Christians began asking whether this bloated institution still followed the humble Christ of the Gospels. Into this storm stepped Jan Hus. Born around 1370 in the tiny Bohemian village of Hussite to peasant parents, he fought his way upward through study and ordination, eventually rising to master at Charles University in Prague and rector of the Bethlehem Chapel. Unlike many who sought comfort and status in the church, Hus was deeply troubled by what he saw: priests who could barely stumble through Latin masses, bishops chasing wealth instead of souls, a papacy obsessed with politics rather than salvation. The glaring gap between the church's preaching of poverty and humility and its actual greed and power became unbearable to him. He discovered the writings of the English theologian John Wycliffe, who insisted that Scripture, not the Pope, must be the final authority for Christians. Though Wycliffe had been condemned as a heretic, his ideas spread like fire among those desperate for reform. Hus began preaching in Czech instead of Latin so ordinary people could finally understand their faith. He taught that salvation came through faith and the Bible alone, not by buying indulgences or obeying papal commands. He demanded the Church return to apostolic poverty and declared that sinful priests forfeited their authority. Crowds, merchants, craftsmen, even nobles, flocked to the Bethlehem Chapel to hear this fearless message. But fame brought danger. The archbishop and clergy, alarmed by his influence, ordered him to stop. When he refused, they appealed to one of the rival popes, John XXIII, who issued a bull forbidding Hus to preach. Hus replied that he must obey God rather than corrupt men, even if they wore the papal tiara. Tensions exploded when Hus publicly condemned the Pope's sale of indulgences to finance a crusade against another papal claimant. This was no mere theological quarrel, it struck at the Church's wealth and power. Hus was excommunicated, Prague placed under interdict, and no Mass or sacrament could be celebrated while he remained. To spare his followers, Hus left the city and spent 2 years preaching and writing in the Bohemian countryside, where his support only grew. In 1414 the Council of Constance was called to heal the schism and reform the Church. Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, desperate for unity, personally invited Hus to attend and explain his views. Most importantly, Sigismund issued a formal safe conduct, guaranteeing Hus protection to, during, and from the council, an oath considered sacred and binding on imperial honor. Hus hesitated, friends begged him not to go, smelling a trap. Yet conscience and faith drove him forward. He believed truth would triumph, Scripture would persuade honest men, and the emperor's word would shield him. On October 11, 1414, escorted by Bohemian knights and clutching Sigismund's promise, Jan Hus left home forever. His trust in imperial honor would prove fatal. He arrived in Constance on November 3 and at first moved freely, preaching in homes and sending hopeful letters back to Prague. But within weeks the mask slipped. This was no debate, it was a trial. On November 28, despite the safe conduct, Hus was arrested by order of the cardinals and Pope John XXIII. When Sigismund protested, he was told promises to heretics did not count and church authority overruled imperial guarantees. Hus was thrown into a dank cell in a Dominican monastery beside the latrines. The stench made him violently ill, food, medicine, and cleanliness were denied him. His body wasted away, but his spirit never broke. He prayed and wrote letters urging his followers to hold fast to gospel truth whatever happened to him. The trial was a farce. Charges were twisted or invented. Whenever Hus tried to explain or quote scripture, he was shouted down. Everything was in Latin so his supporters could not follow. Again and again they demanded total recantation. They offered life imprisonment if he would only admit error. Hus refused. "I would not recede from the truth for a chapel full of gold," he told them. He could not deny what scripture taught just to save his life. His defiance infuriated the council. Meanwhile in Bohemia, anger boiled. Nobles sent furious petitions threatening reprisals if Hus were harmed. That only hardened the council's resolve. He must die as a warning. On July 6, 1415, in Constance Cathedral, one final chance to recant was offered. Weak from prison but resolute, Hus rose and declared he had always taught only what Scripture commanded and could not in conscience deny the truth. "God is my witness that I never preached what false witnesses have testified against me." The council condemned him as a heretic and handed him to the secular arm. They degraded him ritually, stripping away each priestly garment, placing a paper crown painted with devils on his head labeled, "Arch-Heretic." Hus prayed quietly through the humiliation. Emperor Sigismund watched in silence. Led to a meadow outside the walls where a stake awaited, Hus was offered one last chance. He refused again and spoke his famous words, "Today you burn a goose," Hus means goose in Czech, but in a century you will have a swan you can neither roast nor boil. Exactly 102 years later, Martin Luther would nail his theses to the door in Wittenberg. As the flames rose, Jan Hus sang in Latin, "Christ, thou Son of the living God, have mercy upon me." Witnesses said his voice rang out clearly until smoke and fire silenced it, and some saw his lips still moving in prayer. The ashes were raked and thrown into the Rhine so no relic would remain. News reached Bohemia within days. Nobles felt betrayed by Sigismund's broken word. Common people saw a martyr who died for the plain gospel. Riots erupted, churches adopted Hus's reforms. When the council tried to install a new preacher at Bethlehem Chapel, the congregation drove him out. Fury turned to rebellion. The Hussite wars raged for nearly 20 years. Czech armies, using war wagons and handguns, crushed crusade after crusade sent by pope and emperor. These were among the first wars fought mainly for faith, not land or dynasty, and they proved the papacy could be defied with steel as well as words. Hus's writings, smuggled from prison, spread everywhere. When the printing press appeared soon after, his ideas flew faster than ever. Martin Luther himself acknowledged standing on the shoulders of Jan Hus. The betrayal of the safe conduct shattered medieval trust. Emperors and popes could no longer be believed when they promised protection to critics. Reformers learned never to trust guarantees from those they challenged. The Church's choice, violence instead of honest debate, only convinced more people that it cared more for power than truth. It set the pattern for the next century: burn the critic, ignore the criticism. Today historians see Jan Hus as a pivotal figure bridging medieval and modern Europe. His insistence on scripture alone, the vernacular Bible, and an uncorrupted clergy foreshadowed everything the Protestant Reformation would demand. Oxford's Diarmaid MacCulloch has called him the first Protestant martyr. Czechs honor him as both reformer and national hero. The story of Jan Hus shows what happens when one person armed only with truth confronts entrenched power. His faith in promises and rational argument proved tragically naive, yet his death achieved what his life never could: it exposed the corruption he fought and lit a fire the Church could never put out. 6 centuries later, when authorities still wrap their actions in divine approval, Hus's example still speaks. Sometimes conscience demands we resist, whatever the cost. The flames that consumed a humble Czech priest in 1415 kindled a blaze that changed the world, and still burns.